and trying to understand that there has been in history a movement that they believed they were doing the right thing. They believed that their philosophy was the right thing, even if it involved the Holocaust or whatever it involved. It's kind of a hard bullet to swallow, right? Because it's just
you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
That philosophy and ideology is already abstract. As Marta was mentioning, these issues are always important to us, so we get emotionally worked up about it. And so it's very hard to think about a lot of these issues. And then at the same time, when you have a philosophy that seems like the right philosophy to you, if you were born into it, and pretty much everybody in your culture is somewhere in that territory, it's very difficult to step outside of that intellectual framework and understand how other people think of the world.
Hello, my name is Marta.
Hello, my name is Pedro.
And this is Yellow Talks, where we talk about awesome topics with great people. And today with us we have Stephen Hicks, who is a professor of philosophy at Rockford University. He's also a director at the Center of Ethics and Entrepreneurship. But today we're going to talk about his documentary, Nietzsche, the Nazis and National Socialism. Hello, Stephen. Hello, welcome to the show.
Marta, hi, Pedro. Thanks for inviting me.
Hi, nice to have you here. Well, we got to meet you because of the documentary that you have in YouTube. I think the documentary was recorded many years ago, but it has a great quality. And we were really interested in the documentary because you kind of give an overview of why Nazism happens, and also, most importantly, from the philosophical point of view. We'll delve into that later on. But if you can describe quickly what the term National Socialism is for the audience, and what's the difference between fascism, that would be great.
Yes. Well, my thesis is that it's an accurately named movement. They chose the words very well. So nationalism and socialism, and the individuals who started the party in the late 19-teens, shortly after World War I was over, they were socialists of a certain sort. Now, socialism is a very broad label. There are many versions of socialism, and this particular group wanted to distinguish their version of socialism: collective management of resources, government control of the economy, kind of anti-capitalist rhetoric, anti-free market, anti-private property. But at the same time, they wanted to distinguish themselves from the other versions of socialism that thought economics is extremely important, or even that economics is the most fundamental issue. So, for example, the communists, following Karl Marx, their version of socialism is to say that economics is the driver of history, it's the driver of everything else. Culture, religion, politics is superficial relative to these underlying economic drivers. So, and the communists believed that human beings were part of an international community, that all of the people, or the workers especially, had common economic interests, and so national differences are not really that important. So they were international socialists, and that's the label the communists would often use for their movement. So the National Socialists, by choosing the label national, are intentionally distinguishing their version of socialism from the communist version. We are national socialism. So it's going to be socialism pitched at the level of a nation, not internationally. And the argument is that each nation is importantly and perhaps fundamentally culturally different, ethnically different language, customs, religion, ways of doing, and those things are the most important collectivity that should be named. So they chose the name National Socialism. And initially it was a merger of some yet smaller parties that were interested in socialism and some a little more interested in nationalism. But they thought, I think it was in 1919, that a merger and forming a new party would capture importantly. Now, at the tail end of your question, you mentioned fascism, And I can speak to say that, yes, I think National Socialism and fascism are siblings. They're like older brother, younger brother, or brother, sister, some sort of close relationship. Because in the case of fascism, the name technically and originally comes from Benito Mussolini, who was also actually working with some philosophers. And he had made exactly the same move. Mussolini, until he was in his 30s, was a socialist of the Marxist variety, very close to classical Marxism. So he worked to organize the workers, and he was a journalist and a researcher and so forth. But he was very struck by what had happened in World War I, because the Marxist or the communist analysis is that it's all economic forces in collision. And so all of these different big capitalist countries are now colliding with each other. And that's what World War I is all about. And then the workers will realize that they are all equally oppressed by their capitalist masters in the different countries. And capitalism will destroy itself. And out of that will then come the workers' communist revolution. But what Mussolini noticed was that what was really important was to the workers in all of these different countries, Italy especially, Germany, France, was not their class membership, but their national membership. So what really mattered to the workers was, I'm an Italian and we're fighting those other guys, or I'm German, or I'm British. And so he wanted to, his move was then to say, if we're going to be effective as socialists, we cannot pitch socialism as an international movement. Marx was wrong. It has to be nationalistic. It has to be socialism for the Italian people in this case. Now, there are some variations between Italian fascism and German National Socialism, but they are minor in terms of the overall thematic similarities.
We know very well here in Spain because we have Franco, as you already know.
Salazar in Portugal, and they're all, yes, working the same territory.
Yeah. I have a question, like right now in current society, you always hear the term Nazism everywhere, and especially when you refer to right-wing parties. Is that fair to say? Because from what I hear is, there's huge difference, right?
Well, yes, I think it's one of those words that tends to be overused. I mean, initially, it's a self-descriptive label that the theoreticians for a party or for a movement will choose. And the ones that are more articulate, they will work with professional intellectuals and define their terms and their programs quite clearly. But then often when it gets picked up more popularly, it gets broadened and spread out and used more imprecisely. And then, of course, over time, people who are enemies of that particular movement will use it as a pejorative, as an insult, and they will often quite self-consciously want to use guilt by association. So here we have people who are in the movement, but people who will talk to them or who are close. Well, you also are in that movement, and so do these people. So then it becomes this catch-all phrase. So calling people communist or calling them a fascist, or even now calling everybody a racist, it almost becomes a meaningless term. So that's very frustrating for people who want to use terms accurately, because it's important when we're having these important political discussions. Now, at the same time, I do think from the European perspective, now I'm a North American, and the labels are often used differently in North America compared to Latin America and to Europe. I think it is fair to more associate fascism with people on the right, and I'm going to put that in quotation marks, and then other versions of socialism that really emphasize economic matters as more on the left. So I think it's true of European politics that the groups that the people on the left are more interested in have been economic groups, and the people that the groups on the right have been more interested in have been cultural and ethnic groups. So there is a historical accuracy to that. Now, all of that, though, needs working out, and we have to avoid the sloppy use that lots of people just throw words around.
No way.
Yeah, I think that's my feeling too. And I don't know, would you agree that that seems to be a quite kind of a difficult topic and a difficult word as well? Like, I don't know how it is in the North America, but I'm Polish, and definitely when I heard the word Nazism or fascism, it creates a lot of emotions. But I think that a lot of people actually don't know the background. They just have a sort of a label of the word, but they never kind of dive deep to even understand why it came to be like this. And one thing we watched the movie. It's not very scientific. It's the one that won Oscars, I think. All Quiet on the Western Front, and I think it's at the end of it, it's kind of showing the repercussions that Germany will get after the First World War. Could we say that this was sort of a beginning of the whole like movement in a way?
I would not say it was the beginning. I would say that was a very important cultural phenomenon for Germany, because Germany was devastated by the war, and that devastation took a particular form. Now, I want to say that this is important, but I don't think it's the most important factor, because there are lots of countries that lose wars throughout history.
Yeah.
And how they react to losing the war depends on lots of other factors. So if you look at all of the countries that have lost wars in history and have been just devastated, how many of them were electing National Socialists a few years later? Not very many of them. Yeah. So why they thought National Socialism was the best response 10 years later to losing the war, I think you need to bring in some other factors. Now, nonetheless, I do think there was an important ideological component that if you look at German thinking prior to World War I, and I think this is going to be the more important thing for why this war and this loss was so especially devastating to the Germans, was that by the time World War I is beginning, German intellectuals who had been very influential on much of German culture was very well-read, well-educated people. I think the statistics show they were the number one most literate, most educated people in the world. The number of books that were purchased, newspapers that were read, and so forth. But the intellectual culture was very much nationalistic, very much socialistic, and very much authoritarian. Right? So Germany, intellectually and culturally, was very far from the more Anglo nations that were much more liberal and democratic, Republican, and decentralized political authority. But at the same time, there was a kind of overlay from the major thinkers in the German pantheon. So if you think of someone like Karl Marx, who of course was German, and he had a PhD in philosophy, and his economic philosophy has an entire philosophical basis behind it. But it wasn't just that we are more authoritarian and in favor of dictatorship or the proletariat. There was this idea that there was a historical necessity that communism has to come, right? That history is moving in a certain direction, and there's really nothing that we can do to stop. Now, that's a left-wing version of we are going to go in a progressive direction necessarily, and that Germany has a special place in that historical necessity because it's the most advanced, perhaps, nation. Now, the so-called right-wing version, we find almost the same idea. So you have George Hegel, who is the most important kind of philosopher on the right. And he is arguing that, again, history is moving in a certain direction. It's God's plan for the entire world working out through certain special individuals and special peoples to take history to the next stage. And so again, you've got this notion that there is this necessary advance and progress that history has to go through. And again, the idea there was that Germany has a special place in this historical necessity. And that is very widespread among German intellectuals and the thinking German public. So at the same time, they are looking at the West as they think of it, and they're looking at Britain, and they're looking at America. And from their perspective, those nations seem soft. They seem flabby, right? So the ideal there is you're going to get a job working in a shop, or you're going to have your own little farm, right? And you're going to let everybody vote, and everybody just wants to have nice stuff, and they eat a little bit too much food, and there's nothing tough and strong, and you're saying just pursue happiness and be comfortable. So from their perspective, they seem like decadent, weak nations that cannot possibly prevail against Germany, which has this almost God-given or historically necessary left-wing given purpose to take mankind to the next level. So when the war was fought and Germany lost the war, it was a devastation, but it wasn't a normal devastation. It's like, how on earth could we possibly lose the war? And it just blows their mind.
Okay, I get it. Because one of the things that struck me the most watching the documentary, you have to understand that we have been born in democracy, right? Like, trying to understand that there has been in history a movement that they believed they were doing the right thing. They believed that their philosophy was the right thing, even if it involved the Holocaust or whatever it involved. It's kind of a hard bullet to swallow, right? Because it's just
you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
That philosophy and ideology is already abstract. As Marta was mentioning, these issues are always important to us, so we get emotionally worked up about it. And so it's very hard to think about a lot of these issues. And then at the same time, when you have a philosophy that seems like the right philosophy to you, if you were born into it, and pretty much everybody in your culture is somewhere in that territory, it's very difficult to step outside of that intellectual framework and understand how other people think of the world. Unless you spend a lot of time and you train yourself, it's difficult to do. And it's very easy to say, oh, that's just crazy, that's just wicked, that's just ridiculous, and not to take that position seriously.
Yeah, because the usual explanation when we are taught history is that, they don't tell us like that, but, the impression that you have is that Germans are the time were brutes. They were, maybe were under the influence of Hitler because he was an enchanter, or, lots of reasons that try to explain something that behind the scenes is not the truth. Behind the scenes, like, he was elected democratically, like 99% of people voted for him, and they actually believed the philosophy behind, right? And it's hard to understand. It's hard to understand.
Absolutely. He with that 99% vote in 1933, you do want to put a little question mark with respect to that, because that came after Hitler had already been appointed chancellor, and then he's putting it to vote and getting an affirmation. So, but it was a vote. People did not have a gun to their heads, and they were not forced to do so. But I do want to take a little bit more seriously the votes that took place before Hitler was appointed to chancellor, because all of those were, very good democratically run elections. So Weimar Republic, it had all kinds of problems in the 1920s and on into the 1930s, and lots of elections, but they were all legitimate elections, right, for the most part. And you could see the Nazis would get this number of votes, and then they would lose a little, and then they would gain some more, lose a little. And then by the time they won the decisive vote, they had received 40-something% of the popular vote. And that's that's a huge number in a very legitimate election. So it says something. It's also on these other elections, it's important to say that the Nazis got 40-something% of the vote. I think it was 43% of the vote. And there have been American presidents and British prime ministers and so on who have become number one person in their country with that much or less percentage of the vote. But it's also important to say, to come back to this first point about the socialism and the variations on socialism, is that the socialist Democrats I think we're number 2. And the Communist Party was number 3. So you have the top 3 parties in a legitimate election in early 1930s Germany. And well over half of the German population is voting for some kind of socialism. So that says something about where the political culture is at the time.
Yeah, I'm actually wondering, what were people sort of hearing at schools, and what were the conversation between people? Of course, we were not there, but kind of based on knowledge that we have, like what was the topic? What were people, like kids, being taught at the time? Because of course, this also shaped the decisions that people were made.
This would
politics.
be in the 1920s and early 1930s, or after they came to power?
In the 1920s, 1930s.
Yeah, well, certainly in the 1920s, there would be much more plurality of opinion, and there would be a large number of schools that would be teaching a more standardized curriculum, but then still lots of variation, because there are schools that are more religious and some that are more secular, some that are trying to educate only people from elite families, and people and those that are more focused on educating the masses, or people who have less money. So you would find more plurality there. And I don't have expertise, in doing comparison of the curricula at the many hundreds of schools around Germany at that time. The important thing, though, for me would be that all of the people who are teachers, if you then say, these are people who are very well educated. If you're going to become a teacher at a German school in the 1920s, you have to be very well educated. And there are lots of university graduates who may have wanted to have a career as a professor, but they couldn't get a professor job, so they go to teach at a high school. And Germany had a large number of very well educated intellectuals who became teachers. And then what you would then ask is, well, what would they have learned then at their university training that they then would be thinking in terms of? And they're the most important and popular professors and the most widely read public intellectuals would include a huge number of people who were advocates of National Socialist ideology. So if you think of people like Oswald Spengler, who was not a Nazi, but his views were, he wrote The Decline of the West, which sold millions of copies and translated into all sorts of languages. But the point would be that the National Socialist leadership recognized that very much of Spengler is close to their ideology. So they were courting him to try to get him to join the party explicitly. And he thought about it, but he rejected the idea, partly because he didn't like Hitler's personality, which is not really an intellectual reason, but also that he was more pessimistic. His main objection was that he thought the National Socialists were too optimistic. They thought that they could make this great, beautiful new world, but Spengler thought that Germany was in a decline phase and it had to decline. Or Müller-Vandenbroek, who wrote a book, I think it was published in 1923, called The Third Reich. So, if we think of the Third Reich, and that's National Socialism, but this is 10 years before the Nazis came to power, a guy arguing for basically Third Reich political philosophy. And he was very much an advocate of National Socialist policy, and his books sold in the millions, and was very well read. So then you can see lots of other public intellectuals, not only university professors, arguing for some variation on what we now would call Nazi political philosophy.
And at which point did the Nazis decide that it was a good idea to go abroad and start conquering Europe and everything? Because it seems like a big leap, right? It just went out wild, the movement, or?
Yeah, well, obviously it went through various phases, and first in the 1920s, the Weimar Republic was a republic with separations of power, and it was largely democratic. So the Nazis had to be a democratic party in that sense and play by the rules. Mm-hmm. And for the most part, they did play by the rules. They would do some thuggish, more violent actions and so forth, but other parties were doing the same thing as well. But by and large, they were within. So their first order of business was to build up a national political movement and then to succeed at coming to power within Germany, mm-hmm. and then taking Germany in the direction that they wanted to go. But at the same time, if you think ethnicity matters to you most fundamentally, that's the nationalism part, then all of these National Socialist political thinkers and theoreticians were aware of the history of who the German people were, and that they had some in northeastern France, and some in Switzerland, and some in the Czech Republic, and some in Poland, and so on. And so they were very early on interested in some sort of unification of all of the Germanic peoples. Mm-hmm. And then at that point, it becomes partly a matter of individuals who are coming to power and how much territorial ambition they turn to. Now, the other part of this then is it's not only that from the 1920s and quite early on, they're interested in unifying all of the Germans, but they do have the idea that within Europe, and particularly within Germany, there are lots of peoples who they don't think of as properly German. And so they want to get rid of those people. And you can see the development of this. At first, we just need to kind of isolate them within, say, Germany. We'll just have them be in their own ghettos or in their own areas. Or maybe we should just eliminate their civil rights and not let them participate in the political process, but they can stay in Germany. Or maybe we should start thinking about getting rid of them, encouraging them to emigrate and to leave. And then at various points, you start to see suggestions that we need to do something more ruthless, and that's where you start to see the idea that grew into the Holocaust starting to develop. But then again, that's not all of the National Socialists in the 1920s, and how far they're going to go at that point is still quite theoretical because they haven't yet even come to power in Germany. So all of those later developments become more pronounced, more explicit, and more acted upon after 1933, after the Nazis come to power. But it is important to say that while the Nazis were playing the democratic game for the most part in the 20s and 1930s, they were very explicit that they were not democratic. If you read their party program, they say, no, we need to have democracy is bad, republicanism is bad. We need to have an authoritarian regime with a small cadre at the top, and we need to have a Führer, a single supreme leader. So we are instrumentally democratic now, but our program is going to be to abolish democracy once we come to power if you vote for us.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I'm also wondering, we talked about it was a lot of this sort of, I don't want to say hatred, but in a way the view was based on ethnicity, not economics as much. Was there any reason, for example, because we know that Jewish population was catered in a big numbers, and I know there are a lot of Jewish people in Europe at the time in general, but was there any economical reason there as well? Or was it just purely, you're not German, like you don't belong here, like just get out?
Yeah, I think all of those things are mixed together, and there are long-standing historical issues. There were, to their credit, there were lots of Germans who were perfectly fine with assimilating Jews and members of various religions, so Catholics and Protestants, and even a large number of people who were not at all religious. And so there was religious plurality and a significant amount of tolerance in the 20s by historical European standards. But then at the same time, you do have a large number of conspiracy theories already, some for historical religious reasons, if you are very strong in your Christianity and you have a more literalist understanding of religious history, then you will believe that the Jews were responsible for betraying Jesus and for his death. And so you're never going to forgive them. You see them fundamentally as religious enemies. But as you're suggesting, there were people for whom economic issues are more important. One of the important historical factors here is that Christianity, for theological reasons, had always been very much against loaning money and charging interest for loaning money. The idea there was, as Jesus had said, if somebody else needs money, you should give it to them as an act of charity. You shouldn't lend it to them and then charge an interest and try to make a profit on that. So for many centuries, Christianity forbade the charging of interest. Now, there was nothing within Judaism, though, that said charging interest on money was a bad thing. So Christians were, in many Christian countries, forbidden from forming financial institutions that would lend money, the early banks, and then engaging in increasingly capitalistic type financial innovations as the modern world came on. And so you did have a disproportionate number of Jewish people who would go into that line of work. And so many of the first banking fortunes and finance fortunes came from Jewish families. And so they then would have, relative to their numbers, a disproportionate economic impact. And in many cases, it would be actually Shakespeare's play, The Merchant of Venice, is brilliant on this. So I'd recommend that to your readers, or just watch the movie version, The Merchant of Venice. It's very well done right on this. So if you imagine, though, you are a Christian monarch and you want to go to war, there were all of those wars in European history, but wars are very expensive. And so you have to borrow money to finance your war. Well, who are you going to go to have to borrow the money? And then as a Christian, you think of yourself as superior to those Jews who are down there. But now you have to go and be nice and say, would you please lend me some money, right, to these Jewish people? And so the cultural dynamic in the mix is very, very poisoned. So all of this is there. And then we do know that the Jews, in addition to the religious issues and the economic issues, they are ethnically, they have their own customs, and in many cases, people have a hard time recognizing other people's customs as legitimate. They just seem weird and alien. And so just for more straight ethnic reasons, you feel discomfort being around people who are ethnically too different. So all of that is long time in European history, a long time in German history, and all of that still is circulating in the 1920s. And the National Socialists, of course, are importantly using the Jews and all of that anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism consciously as part of their political program.
Okay. Given the fact that we are talking all the time that philosophy plays a big role in how Nazism play out, who do you think is the person that took a big role from philosophy point of view? Like you mentioned Nietzsche in your documentary. Is he the main one?
Yeah, certainly Nietzsche. I mentioned earlier Hegel. I mentioned Marx. So just to take a little sidestep, for example, to go back to the question of fascism and Italian fascism, one of the very important documents, founding documents of Italian fascism is an article, it's actually a short monograph written by Benito Mussolini and Giovanni Gentile, who was a professor of philosophy at a very well-regarded, one of the most famous philosophers in Italy. And Mussolini teamed up with him to write the official doctrine of what fascism is. So that's a very clear case of a politician teaming up with a philosopher to form an ideology. And also Alfredo Rocco, another Italian philosopher, is important here. Now, in the case of Germany, philosophers who are going to be important are, in addition to the three that we've just mentioned, but also Martin Heidegger, And Martin Heidegger, already by the 1920s, was recognized as the most important and brilliant philosopher in Germany. And still, like 100 years later, if you ask professional philosophers who the most important philosophers of the last century are, all of them will put Heidegger on their top list. You know, they might hate him or they might love him, but Heidegger is right up there. And this is in Germany. You know, the German philosophers are the best trained in the world in the 1920s. So Heidegger was a National Socialist. You know, he joined the party. He was a gung-ho supporter of National Socialism. And then many of the other intellectuals, had PhDs in philosophy, and they are arguing recognizably for this would not be party National Socialism with a capital N and capital S, but for National Socialist doctrines in the 1920s. So I would also say we come back to Hegel and say more about him, and Nietzsche and say more about him. But also Karl Marx, and this is perhaps a surprising one. But we focus a lot, of course, on Adolf Hitler, but probably the number 2 or number 3 most important Nazi of all time was Joseph Goebbels, who was the party's chief ideologist and propagandist and controller, and he had a PhD, a very, very well-educated man. And Joseph Goebbels was in love with Karl Marx. You know, he quoted Karl Marx. He thought, Marxist philosophy was great and wonderful, hated the capitalists, hated people who made money. And Goebbels's rhetoric, even as a National Socialist, is filled with Marxist language, right, and tropes. Now, he is one of the ones, though, for whom probably the economic issues are a little bit more important than the nationalistic issues. For Hitler, the nationalism issues are probably a little more important than the economic issues. And then if you start talking about Goering and all of the other high-level Nazi leadership, you'll have different emphases on which things are more important. So of the big guns, the very most important, though, I would say Hegel, Nietzsche, Marx, Heidegger would all be huge philosophers, all of them with PhDs in philosophy, and all of them are important contributors to National Socialist ideology.
I'm wondering, I'm going to go a little bit like on a high level of the topic. Was there anything that particularly surprised you when you were kind of studying the topic and doing research for a documentary that you were like, no way? It could be anything that comes to your mind.
Yeah. Well, it was a couple of things. You know, when I went through university, one of the things that I always thought it was kind of suspicious and ridiculous, even when I was a teenager, was the idea that the political spectrum should be arrayed from left to right. That's why I've been kind of putting left and right in quotation marks. And what I was taught, and I remember actually hearing this in high school, was that at the far left, you had communism and Karl Marx, but then at the far right end of the political spectrum, you had the fascists and the National Socialists, and so people like Hitler and Mussolini. And so that then portrays them as polar opposites, as far away from each other as you can possibly get. So when I remember when I was an undergraduate student thinking that can't be right, because if you then have this spectrum of far left and far right, where would you put people who are liberals, who are Democrats? And it didn't make conceptual sense to me to say that in some sense we're just taking Karl Marx and Adolf Hitler and we're compromising, in various ways to work out some middle territory. It's like, no, it's not a compromise. It's a different kind of political philosophy. So one of the things that was surprising to me, though, was how much the people on the so-called far right, had come out of the far left, or even when they had defected from the far left, still thought of themselves as being on the left politically. Now, the left and right are still metaphorical terms, and you have to add some actual content to them. But what you find in common is you have this strong collectivism on the left of economic classes, and then you have collectivism on the right. There, it's just typically more ethnic groups. You have this idea that we're not peaceful, that we all hate each other, and we're driven by these group conflicts, rather than this idea of peace and trade and harmony. And both of them are explicitly saying we can't be democratic and we can't be Republican. We need to have dictatorship of the proletariat and violent revolution, or we need to have authoritarian strongman, right, and so on. So that it struck me, the more I read into it, how they were very close to each other at a certain level of abstraction. So that was one of the surprising things. And then I'll pause right there. That was probably number one, but I could say more things, but I'll kick it back to you.
Okay. I have a twofold question. World War II was like a conflict of two main philosophies. Like, this is a generalization, but it was collectivism against liberalism, right? More or less, yeah. But like, we won the war. Let's put it this way. But ideas are hard to erase. So my first question is, have we really won? I mean, and if not, are we really in danger of repeating history again? Like, what are the main philosophies rising in the world nowadays?
No, that's a great question. I have a draft for an article on this historical issue, and I want to call it "The Germans Won the War." In fact, picking up on this theme. So what you're suggesting is exactly right. The physical confrontation between nations that were more individualistic, liberal, democratic, republican, in variations, but that's why they were allied with each other. And then the nations that were more authoritarian and collectivistic, that's why they were allied with each other. When that physical confrontation occurred, yes, the liberal, individualist, democratic, republican nations, they won the war. And then it was also the case that after the war was over and we realized how horrible the National Socialist regime had been, including the Holocaust, which was just devastating to everyone, then out of kind of National Socialism and fascism fell out of favor for perhaps 50 years. And so then the next 50-year chunk of history really is some sort of liberal individualism against collectivist socialism in the Soviet Union. So we have Cold War politics. But then we know 1989 through 1981, the Soviet Union and all of its associated client states, they collapse. And again, we won the Cold War, right? And so at that point, everybody thinks, well, we're all going to be liberal, democratic, republican, capitalists, right, of some sort or other. But this is the staying power and the importance of philosophy. So we beat the fascists and we beat the National Socialists on the battlefield, but those ideas were not ever defeated. And the same thing is true now, a generation. Communism and its variations on socialism, they lost terribly over the course of the 20th century. But the ideas were not defeated intellectually. And so what we are seeing right now, just in the last 5 or 6 years, is people who did not live through the history, people who did not learn the history very well in school, all of those ideas then are coming back. And so we have a very strong resurgence of various kinds of fascism and National Socialism, various versions of left-wing socialism as well. Of course, there are still lots of people who are liberal democratic. So we are having exactly the same ideological debates and discussions and the same political party shifts and alignments in the 2020s that were happening in the 1920s. So we have in that sense come full circle. Now, why I want to say the Germans won the war, obviously that doesn't mean the physical war, it means the intellectual war. Because what we find is that the ideas that were generated by German intellectuals for the most part, right? So thinkers like the ones we've mentioned before, Nietzsche and Heidegger, they're still in the mix. and they're importantly in the mix right now. Karl Marx obviously is still in the mix, another German intellectual. Carl Schmitt is still in the mix. And so all of these German intellectuals are being rehabilitated by people that we now think of as being on the nationalistic right. I would throw in there, for example, Alexander Dugin, the Russian philosopher, who's the most famous of the Russian philosophers right now. Sometimes he's called Putin's brain. I don't know exactly how true that is, but he has huge stature, and he is a Heideggerian. He explicitly says, I am a disciple of Martin Heidegger. His philosophy is absolutely correct, and we just need to take Heideggerian philosophy and adapt it to the Russian context. But it's the exact same ideas, right, coming back again. And the same thing I would say is happening on the left, where Marx is being rehabilitated, right, once again. In this case, it's German philosophy, but it went through a French route for the most part. So Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida and the other famous French postmodernists, as we call them, they're now a generation in the past, but all of them are disciples of Marx and Nietzsche and Heidegger, and they will explicitly tell you they are disciples of those three figures, taking a kind of left-wing ideology and rehabilitating it for this generation. So it's still German philosophy versus whatever the opposite of that is philosophically.
That's interesting. So many years later, I have it's not a question, just a thought. I wonder what's the role of because now obviously we have so much access to social media, internet, and there's a lot of sort of stories online and not necessarily are real or not. I just wonder if that actually are doing a bit of a disservice and maybe showing some of the ideologies of philosophies in maybe brighter lights there that they should be shown, or.
Well, I think that's got to be part of the game. So if we are liberal in the generic political sense, then I think what that means we need to obviously have free minds and freedom of action, but also we need to learn how to think freely and act freely. And so that means being exposed to the most important debates on all of the most important issues. And so I think good education by parents and teachers and other people will say, you need to know that not everybody is going to agree with you on everything. And even if we think liberal individualistic ideas are the best ones, you need to not just repeat them like a robot because we told you they are true. You really need to understand them. And so that means you need to get into the psychology and the philosophy and learn something about the history. And you also need to, so that you are intellectually armed, understand that some very smart people have come up with good arguments for anti-liberal and anti-individualistic positions. So I think it's part of a healthy liberal culture that there will be people who advocate anti-liberal ideals. They will use all of the tools like social media that really are developed by liberal institutions to make their case. And we have to freely allow them to do so and enter into those debates. And the important thing is that we need to be able to out-argue them and make the case for some kind of liberal individualism more effectively than their enemies do. And that has to happen every single generation.
That's very true. Pedro, do you have any more questions? Because we have a few minutes left, so we can use the time before we ask final questions.
I have lots of questions, but I'm going to try to choose one. I've always made this thought experiment sometimes. If the Germans had really won the physical war, what would the world look like now? I mean,
all of these counterfactual histories questions or what if history questions are interesting. I started to watch, there was a television series based exactly on that premise. So I know sorry?
in Netflix. I can't remember the title, but yeah, I think I know which one.
Yeah, so the idea is that the Germans and the Japanese won the war, and so in the United States, the Japanese are controlling the Western, and the Germans are controlling the Eastern. And there, I think that's fascinating, but it is largely speculative. So I think the best thing to do would be to look at historical examples. So there are lots of cases, for example, where a country was conquered by another dominant country, and it basically went away. It became absorbed into the conquering culture. It's also the case, and there are lots of examples of this, where a country lost the war, and then it was temporarily absorbed into the larger country, but they, in the next generation, fought back. And perhaps they went underground, and they succeeded in throwing off the overthrowers. So my sense is, if the Germans had won the war, my best guess is that they could have taken, say, all of Europe and all of Britain, and then we would have some sort of United States of Europe, right? But overseen by the Germans. How long that would have lasted before kind of native nationalistic assertiveness would have sprung up, and the Spaniards and the British and the Norwegians would have regained their independence. That I don't know, but I think the look of I don't think they would have been able to cross the Atlantic and take over North America, for example. Nor do I think the Japanese, rather, even if they had been successful in the Asian War, been able to cross the Pacific. So I think you would have three big blocks, but how long those three big blocks would be stable for, I have no idea.
Yeah, I think I lied. I'm going to ask one more question quickly.
Go for it.
Because you are more educated than us, and you have a more comprehensive answer to this question. Like, it always fascinates me that there are tribes, there are countries around the world that are stagnated in time; they never change, right? And whereas others, like Europe in the last 2 centuries, have gone through so many changes. What's the main trigger in those changes for a given tribe? It's just philosophy. It is what's the main? If you had to say one main drive, what is the main drive that makes tribes change?
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting, you put that question negatively or positively. I think in some cases there are tribes that don't change, and that would be the negative version. And they don't change largely for environmental reasons. So I think they are in a circumstance of, say, resource impoverishment. They live in a largely desert area. So if I think of the San people in Botswana, or the Aboriginals of Australia, would be two good examples here. And so much of their time is devoted simply to staying alive, that you don't have the leisure space to start becoming inventive, to come up with new ideas for social organization or new technologies. So they will remain static for a certain amount of time. But if you are in a more resource-rich place and you do enough philosophy to start thinking just stealing from each other and constantly going to war is not going to be good for anybody, let's be a little more trading and tolerant. So you get yourself to the point where there's enough peace and stability and cultural respect for basic reasonable laws, then you're going to generate some wealth, and you're going to generate the amount of time that human cleverness can start to think more abstractly, more long-term. And at that point, things can take off very quickly if people come on to kind of social ideas that really leverage human creativity, or they come up with technological ideas that leverage human productivity.
Yeah, because I asked the question because I don't think people really realize the role of philosophy in humanity, like how it triggers so many changes. Like you put it that way, when we have time to think, then it moves the world.
Yeah. So just to take one very interesting thread, if you think, for example, of religion and the role of religion. So Europe was largely static for many, many centuries up until the 1500s and 1600s or so. But then you could say, and this would just be one line of argument, you could say along comes someone like Martin Luther, And he and the early other protesters who become Protestants, they want to reform the church. And so the Reformation gets launched. Now, they were true believers in a very fundamental version of Christianity, but there was an unintended consequence of just one of their ideas, the idea that instead of getting to God by going through the hierarchy of the church, every individual should be able to have his or her own relationship with God, right? And so that's really a big philosophical idea right there. Now, but then that means if everybody's going to have their own relationship with God, they need to be able to understand God's word. And that means they need to be able to read the Bible. And that means we need to translate the Bible out of Greek and Latin into the languages of Italian and French and English so everybody can read the Bible for themselves. Now, Luther and the other reformers' idea is that everybody's going to read the Bible and believe it is true and get into a traditional relationship with God. But the unintended consequence is that suddenly you have millions of people who now can read, and they're reading important abstract things, and they start, as humans do, having arguments about theological issues. And as soon as people start reading and having arguments, they get smarter, and they also get curious about other books. And so that one philosophical revolution has just a huge social implication for the way Western history went.
So that's a very interesting point.
Yeah.
I'll cheat one. I'll ask one question. Hopefully, it's not too vague. What do you think is the state of philosophy in 2023?
Oh, yes. Well, that's a very hard question to answer. I think overall, the state of philosophy is healthy in 2023 compared to, say, 50 years ago when I was a kid. In the 1950s, 60s, and into the early 1970s, philosophy was in a very skeptical place where the leading schools of philosophy were explicitly, we don't know anything, or they were pessimistic about the prospects for their philosophies. But I do think starting in the 1980s, especially, you started to see philosophers who are on average are very interested in ideas getting bored. This is putting it too casually with all of the old skeptical arguments, and starting to say, well, let's try some new ideas. And they became, some of them, more interested in science, in biotechnology, in applied ethics. There was a resurgence in restudying the great historical philosophers and doing new and better translations and working out. So philosophy, I think, became healthier. Now, it's very hard to make a generalization about a big movement because it's also now international. Right? It's not the case that, there's just some top philosophy departments in France and England and America. Instead, there's great philosophy being done all over the world. And as you were alluding to, it's also gone on social media. So now instead of just, maybe a few thousand undergraduate students taking serious philosophy at universities every year, you've got millions of young people self-studying philosophy as well. So I think on both of those scores, philosophy is healthier than it was 50 years ago.
That's really good news. Last question.
No, I mean, we can go with personal questions.
Okay. Well, we can do two in one, actually. They're kind of connected. Could you tell us what is the thing you learned the hard way?
Well, that's a hard question. Yeah.
That is a hard one. There's one more following, but I think it's easier.
Okay. All right. Well, the one that comes to mind, I would say, is when I decided that I wanted to become a philosopher. So I started to take philosophy seriously, and I had my views on various sorts of issues. But one of the things I learned very quickly was that if you're going to be serious about ideas, if you really think the truth matters, then you have to, in a way, let yourself go into philosophies that initially you think are wrong-headed and crazy. You have to really give them a fair shot, read their best advocates, and not simply look for one little mistake that you can then set the whole thing aside. There's a reason why the great philosophers are thought of as great philosophers. And on the emotional side, you mentioned the emotional side earlier. When you believe certain things are important and you have your sense of personal identity and what your important values and your religious values and your political values are, that you are going to feel personally attacked every time you do that. Right? That you are putting yourself on the line. And there are, we know, lots of shortcuts and ways of cheating that people will engage in at that point. They'll say, I don't want to do that hard work, but I don't want to risk anything that I think really is important and true to me. And so they will sabotage their own ability to do philosophy seriously. Now, we're typically well aware of the way this comes out in social media, right? All of the way that people will avoid argument or turn it into a personal attack, right? And so on. So I remember reading some very skeptical philosophies and, I started thinking, wow, do we really actually know anything, right? And then all of the, the values, because I was getting a little bit cynical, I would say, in my late teens, as I was, learning more about Canadian politics, where I grew up, and American politics and world politics. And so, thinking, maybe there is no genuine fairness and justice in the world, that everything is this, grubby power struggle and everybody's hypocritical and so on. But at the same time, I still had some strong liberal individualism, and I thought there was something true. But all of those were attacked and assaulted, and I had to really think through all of them on a regular basis. And that also included in social context. So in one way, I was very fortunate where I went to university in Canada, at the University of Guelph. They had a large number of philosophers of very different philosophical perspectives, but not very many philosophy majors for some reason. So a lot of my courses ended up being just me and the professor, like a one-on-one course, or two students and the professor. And so there are ways you can hide from your professor and do avoidance, or you can say, no, I'm really going to ask these hard questions, and I'm going to let the professor challenge all of my opinions and all of my arguments. My professor is like Socrates, and I'm still the young guy right at that point. That I'm really going to go for that and not be scared of the process and work through that. But that's a psychologically hard lesson. And I remember, at one point where I was feeling, I've been reading very skeptical and all kinds of very anti-liberal and anti-individualistic people, and I was feeling like, wow, I'm really under assault here, but I'm not going to run away. I'm going to go for it. So I would say we all are going to go through that, right, at some point, and you have to go for it. Make the leap, right? Be courageous. The truth really matters, and as Nietzsche said, I think this is rhetorically clever, right? That which does not kill you does in fact, right, make you stronger. Beautiful. That's right. That's the only way to become strong.
We had the closing question, but I think you sort of answered it already, unless there's something else. We usually ask our guests if they have any sort of advice or any thought to share with the audience. What you said already was great, but maybe you have something else to tell us now.
No, especially for young people. Yeah, I would say, since I'm a professor at a university, and so I'm dealing with 18 to 22-year-old people on a regular basis. The general advice I like to give to students coming to university is, when you are in your first year of university, take 10 different courses in 10 things you've never studied before, if you possibly can. So really broaden your horizons. There's a lot of very, very interesting stuff out there. And the other thing I would say is, don't commit to any one philosophy or politics or religion too quickly. Right? It's very easy when you're young and you're smart to understand a philosophical or a political position, and almost all of them have able advocates and some internal consistency. And so it's easy to be seduced very quickly. And part of, I think, of human psychology is we want answers to questions, and we want to have a comprehensive philosophy as part of our intellectual machinery. But don't get there too quickly, and go through the process. And before you settle on one philosophy, make sure you are aware of the major competitors and you've given them a fair shot, and set yourself the project of perhaps being like at a smorgasbord type restaurant where you can pick and choose from all of the different recipes and form your own personal philosophy. Put yourself on that quest, and that's the most rewarding quest.
That's awesome. I wish we were at university, but we are not 22 anymore.
Not anymore.
Maybe at one point again.
No, I want to go back to university again.
Same, but well, we can educate ourselves differently these days. But that's a great advice.
Yeah, great advice. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and we hope we can host you in the future to talk about any other subject. And yeah, we wish you the best. Thank you.
All right, pleasure. Great questions, and yeah, thanks for the time.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.